Thank you so much. I'd like to add my welcome to today's APICS webcast, which is sponsored by Logility, a leading supplier of collaborative supply chain and retail optimization solutions. I am Corinne Bursa, and it's my pleasure to be your host for today's interactive webcast. Removing barriers to inventory optimization. You know, inventory management is at the heart of many supply chain initiatives. And depending upon your role in the company, you may view inventory quite differently. For instance, if you're in finance and accounting, you often view inventory as a risk or simply as a cost of the business. Supply chain often views inventory as an outcome or a buffer, something that can cover our lead time. Sales executives, they see inventory completely differently. They see inventory as an opportunity. It's the opportunity to take any order on any day, to fill any customer order. What inventory really represents for your business is leverage. It's an investment. It's an investment to be leveraged to satisfy customers, to gain market share, and to drive revenues. And to be effective, that inventory must be held in the right quantity, the right place, the right time to satisfy customer demand when and where the customer wants it. It sounds simple enough, but the fact is our single-stage inventory management practices, things like rules of thumb or 20 days forward coverage, are just not good enough for today's dynamic global supply chains. Even statistically calculated safety stock, it doesn't provide adequate precision or time phase changes. Inventory optimization technology and the accompanying business processes, they've been proven in the marketplace for more than 12 years, and the results are clear. The payoff and better leverage from your inventory investments is going to create a more agile, a more profitable business that your customers can depend on for great service. That's why I'm really excited about today's topic, and here to discuss how we remove these barriers to inventory optimization are Vinder Sodhi with Deloitte and Chris Russell with Logility. Now, Vinder, you've been focused on this area for well over 10 years and worked on a number of significant transformations in the area of supply chain. Your experience spans a number of industries like retail, food and beverage, consumer packaged goods, and high tech. Tell us what gets you excited about working with companies in these industries to optimize inventory.
Thanks, Corinne. I would say it's a couple of things. The first and foremost is, consumer products, high tech, things that are they're intrinsically interesting to me, things that I can touch and feel. That's the first part of it. The second part of it is I love solving big, complex, hairy problems, and there's nothing quite as big and complex and hairy as inventory optimization. So that's the second component. And the third component is I love seeing, bringing business value and seeing transformations in my clients. So that's really what, that's what causes me to wake up in the morning.
So lots of opportunity in lots of different business climates and business sectors. So Chris Russell is bringing about 20 years of supply chain technology experience, and really kind of a no-nonsense communication style to our discussion today. Chris, you've had the opportunity to look at the supply chain practices of some of the best businesses in the world. What is a common theme when companies are making this transition from inventory management to inventory optimization?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is a very timely and practical discussion that it's really excited to be working with Vinder on this white paper and webinar because I think we're going to help a lot of people. And specifically what we see when we're out there is folks that they want to do something. They have inventory imperatives, but they've just hit the wall. And they're looking for those ways to improve, and I think that's something with the knowledge and technology we can enable that leap to the next level of proficiency.
Excellent, and that's what we're here to talk about today. In fact, I want to give you guys a feel for our audience today and where they are with their supply chain initiatives. During the registration process, we asked a few questions about the folks that were registering and their experience in this area of inventory optimization. One of the questions is, do you believe that there's excess inventory in your supply chain? And if you do believe that, what % of excess do you think is there? So first thing to point out is 76% of our audience believes they have excess inventory. 24% responded that they don't know. That means 76% believe there's some, and then it's distributed in 4 major areas. Vendor, when you look at these results, what do you make of them?
I'd say I have 2 observations. The first is I'm not surprised by the fact that a quarter of the respondents didn't know, and that's typical. I do see that all the time. The second observation I'd make is about 40% of the respondents thought they only had up to 20% excess inventory. That surprises me. I mean, in my experience with my clients, I generally see that when we actually start measuring how much is excess, we definitely see it's in excess of 20%. So those are the 2 things that really jumped out at me.
Okay, so definitely double-digit in most scenarios of companies that we're working with in our experience and in your experience. Chris, any additional insights?
Yeah, I agree with Vendor, and it's clearly what we find when we go in is people have a gut feeling that they have too much inventory or the wrong inventory or the right inventory in the wrong place, but they just don't know where it is. Figuring out where it is and how to get to it. And again, that's where the science and the application of multi-echelon inventory optimization can really help.
Okay, very good. Right, so we asked another question during the registration process, and it is, if you do perform inventory optimization within your supply chain, what is the scope? I found this to be really interesting as well. So 26% say they don't know, which means that they're here with us today and tapping into the Apex resources to get a good, strong foundation on what inventory optimization means and what the potential is for their business. But what stood out for me is there at 6 o'clock, you see multi-echelon inventory optimization across multiple stages and locations. We had 15% of our audience indicate that that's where they are today. To me, these are our supply chain rock stars. Chris, what do you think about the focus on finished goods with some of these other responses?
And that's again very typical when we go in to see people for the first time. Is they're very focused on finished goods for a couple of reasons. One is that's where all the money is in their minds, and also that's typically where there's the most information around. But that's really a sign of immaturity in inventory optimization, focusing on inventory in just one area, like finished goods. We will look to move them to optimizing inventory holistically across the supply chain, and that's the way they can move along that maturity curve and get to that organizational and operational excellence, again, break through the barrier and get through the next level.
Vendor, what are your thoughts?
I'd say, if there's one thing that really stands out for me, with this data is that at least 85% of our respondents, there's room for improvement and there's an opportunity.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's lots of opportunities, and they come in different forms. And what I would like to share actually is some research that was done by the Aberdeen Group. So the Aberdeen Group did a research initiative around multi-echelon inventory optimization and comparing companies that tap inventory optimization to those that use really a focused practice on finished goods only or single stage inventory management practices. And what they found is the payback is huge. There's a 28% increase in inventory turns with inventory optimization, 28%. I mean, that's a huge competitive advantage in the marketplace. But what they also found is that these companies are 2 times more effective at balancing inventory and service. They're also twice as likely to tie the inventory practices and policies into the sales and operations planning process, making it more strategic, looking at longer-term horizons, comparing scenarios, but also in that tactical setting of inventory targets for their business to get the desired results that they're looking at. So you see greater alignment, you see the opportunity for cost reduction, the opportunity to boost service levels, and then really this agility to model your business really effectively. So with that said, now that we have a feel for our audience today, let's talk about how do we remove the barriers to inventory optimization And where do we go from here? Why aren't more companies doing this? If there's tangible payback, if it changes our ability to respond to market needs, market changes, and working with our suppliers and customers more effectively, what are those barriers, Vendor? Take us through that.
For me, I think the biggest barrier that I've seen is we've tried to do this in the past. We got mixed results, and you know what? We're just going to focus our efforts elsewhere. So whether it was, a company implementing, a supply and demand planning, capability that had a single stage, safety stock solution where maybe they only modeled half of the uncertainty, demand side certainty in particular, and they didn't see the immediate benefits. Right? And then, when they actually looked at what it would actually take to get the complete, sort of holistic view, they said, this is too hard from a process perspective. It's too much of a black box for me to understand how this is going to work. And never mind, I have to get an entire organization, a supply chain organization behind me, to actually transform to this way of thinking. It's often been a perception of fear of complexity than it has actually been people taking the time to actually try to execute it. At least from sort of the process and organization perspective, that's where we've seen the complexity and fear come from.
So, when you talk about complexity, it's both in product portfolio, in the design of the supply chain network, as well as how do I get my arms around solving that problem.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So it comes in a lot of different forms.
Yep. And I'd say, again, I'd come back to it's often more driven out of fear of complexity than actually, than the complexity is actually, if it's actually there at all.
Okay. All right. Chris, what about technology?
Yeah, as Vendor pointed out, there's some complexity here, both perceived and actual, but like what gets him out of bed are these big, hairy problems. That's what gets us out of bed at Logility, is solving these fairly complex inventory problems. So like I said before, we help companies get past that fear, get past that complexity, and get unstuck from those inventory plateaus and move beyond simple single-stage ERP and spreadsheet solutions. So that technology, or lack of technology in this case, is a real barrier to their progress, and typically what they're using won't get the job done.
Yeah, spending hours and hours in front of a spreadsheet and trying to make dynamic changes, that can be quite challenging. Well, so let's start talking about how we remove these barriers, right? That's what our call is all about today. And I want, Vendor, could you take us through from a process orientation, between Deloitte and Logility, we've got the right experts here with us. We've attacked this problem from a lot of different angles. And I think we've put together here 3 major steps. Take us through that, and then let's start digging into the meat of the issue.
Sure thing. And I think any time, when we look at a problem that we're trying to solve, the first thing we've got to do is assess. Assess where we are today. How are we doing? What does that, how are we doing against what does good look like? What does the opportunity look like in front of us? That's really step 1, assessing the capability. Step 2 is then saying, all right, understanding that capability, how do I build it from both a process, technology, and people perspective, and make sure it's sustainable? It's easy to understand, everyone gets it, and everyone's aligned. Now, once I've got that, I have that capability, I can actually leverage it as a platform to make even more strategic and fundamental changes in my supply chain. So it's really those 3 steps of, understand where we are, what does the opportunity look like, let's put something in place that's sustainable, and then let's take it to the next level and deliver really strategic value.
Did you find somewhere in this process people get stuck, Vendor?
I would actually say where I've seen people get stuck is in the build and sustain. Everyone sees the opportunity. We have, at least on the phone, 40% of the respondents said, somewhere between 5 and 20%, 5 and 25% is excess inventory. But when we actually get into the how do I fix it, that's where we have this, they get stuck.
Right.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about assessing our capabilities in this area.
So I think I alluded to it a little bit. There's probably a few main steps that we want to look at. So the first is really, in terms of our inventory performance, what's our customer service levels? However we decide to measure that. What's our current inventory levels? Days on hand, dollars. What does that look like? And then if I model, what it should look like based on my demand uncertainty, based on my supply uncertainty, based on the complexity of my supply chain, and based on maybe my financial performance goals, that's going to help me understand financially where should I, what am I what are the goals that I'm looking to achieve. So that's sort of my business performance. Then I want to look at how does my process work today? How do I plan my inventory? Who does it? And who's responsible? Do they sit within a supply chain group? Do they sit within the business? How do they work together with sales and with manufacturing? The last couple of pieces really, how does that process work within S&OP? Leading S&OP processes, have inventory optimization at the core.
Yes.
It's not an outside process. It's part of S&OP. Does that happen today? And then I'd say the last component is really, what technology am I using? Am I using a spreadsheet? Am I using, do I keep 10 days on hand in my ERP solution? Am I using a single stage, a single echelon, safety stock calculator that I can go check in my APIX manual? What am I doing? How is that really being modeled? That's the really understanding. Where am I today?
Mm-hmm. So once we assess where we are and we all agree we've got an opportunity, right, that's where this whole build and sustain starts. So this is a little more intensive in some of the activities that are going on.
Correct. So here is, I'd say this is a simplified version of an inventory optimization process. There's probably several levels here, but really there's 4 or 5 steps. 1, make sure I've got the right data, master data, my transactional data. Do I have my network modeled correctly? The second piece is, what is my inventory strategy? What's the inventory policy for my company? What is going to drive the calculator in the end? The third piece is going to be actually calculating, what could my inventory be, and then actually running scenarios. And I can't stress how important scenarios are. Then I want to make sure that I've validated and I have consensus on my inventory targets, and that it's easily published from wherever I'm calculating my inventory targets into my planning and transaction systems. And then I want to make sure I'm monitoring and tuning that performance over time. So I've got dashboards, I've got KPIs, I've got flow charts to say if I'm having an excess problem, what are the 5 or 6 steps I need to do, and what's the decision look like? So on this slide, we actually see more details of the process, and I would say we've called out a few of these, but the key ones I want everyone to focus on is really probably defining those inventory drivers based on the strategy, and then at the end, also equally important, what are my distribution strategies that could also influence my inventory performance? Do I have long lead times? Am I a deploy to order? What is it, a flow-through model? These are all things that may not be top of mind when considering my inventory strategy, but are absolutely influencers in terms of improving my inventory performance. The last one I wanted to kind of highlight here again is, and I come back to it, and Chris, you can speak to this, it's all about scenarios. Yeah. I have a baseline scenario, but what if? What if I changed my customer service strategy? What if I changed lead times?
Yep.
And how do I see that easily?
Sure. And I think there's really 2 important things that the technology does when we look at this phase of removing the barriers in the process. The first one is to just simply to generate those multi-echelon targets and provide those, like you said, to the users in such a way, or the supply chain in such a way that they can own them, that they understand them and say, yeah, these are right. It's not just a black box, right? Otherwise you'll get a revolution, they'll never use them. And then the second piece, like you said, is being able to do those what-if scenarios, being able to propagate that demand and supply uncertainty, the changes in lead time, the changes in fill rates, service levels, distribution policies, being able to spread that up and down the supply chain and see what does that do in my inventory policy, where can I apply that inventory, like Corinne said, as leverage in my supply chain to meet my business goals.
So when we start thinking about that, You know, the first thing that comes to mind for me is not all inventory is held for the same reason, Chris. So as companies start learning more about their business and they're determining their inventory strategy, they're looking at these scenarios and the drivers, this is kind of interesting to me.
Right. We're all familiar with the story of management coming in and saying, cut inventory by 10%.
10%, yeah.
And the correct answer should be what inventory? Because inventory exists for different reasons within the supply chain, right? Mm-hmm. And it would be really nice for those same supply chain professionals to be able to go back with data and say, here's where the inventory is, and here's why it exists. This inventory is here to buffer against demand uncertainty. This inventory is here to buffer against a long lead time. This inventory is here to buffer against a batch size that purchasing came up with. And typically we find people are doing this in a vacuum. They're making these decisions on policies and they don't understand the interrelated impact on inventory.
Or they're not connecting with the right teams to say, what if we change this?
Right.
Do we have the ability to perhaps reduce the amount every time I purchase from one of my vendors? Because it's not just safety stock. There's safety stock, there's cycle stock, there's stock that's due to inventory that's in transit. There are many different components. We have to be able to understand that holistically, understand where we could, if we were given the mandate of cut 10%, how would we achieve that?
Right. And you can't get there with a spreadsheet, or you can't get there fast enough to have it actually influence the business.
That's why I think this area of actually modeling the capabilities and why we're holding inventory is just fascinating. I mean, I'm a numbers cruncher, like a lot of supply chain people, but I get really excited about looking at the opportunity and being able to visualize that. There's a lot of power. What we're seeing here is a very simple view, but it gives you an appreciation for those echelons, the procurement, the sub-assemblies, the production, distribution as a constraint, as well as customers or demand fulfillment locations. Vendor, walk us through what we're seeing here and maybe, this comparison of two different scenarios in the mix.
I mean, I think here the key to understand is that just the ability to visualize it is extremely powerful. Mm-hmm. The aha moment comes when I'm visualizing, because certain companies may not know why they have inventory in certain places. They may just thought, put it at the closest point to the customer, because that will allow us to maintain, the highest service levels. But being able to model a change of saying, let's not put it at the closest point of the customer, because frankly the next closest point upstream is only a day away. You may have incredible savings on inventory safety stock, because you're now buffering at one location versus 3, at least in this model. Or I may have immense savings on transportation costs, because it's not just about the cost of inventory. It's also about the cost of moving stock. We all know transportation is quite high. We all know just the cost of moving inventory even within a DC is quite high. So it has to be considered holistically and within scenarios, and having the ability to do that in one place is immensely powerful.
And one of the things, we talk about inventory a lot here, but we're also talking about service levels and fill rates, right? That's the other side of this equation, goes hand in hand. And a lot of times people are randomly setting service levels within these echelons in the supply chain. You really want to drive that as a demand-driven customer from the customer service level requirement all the way through the organization. You get everybody operating to the same sheet of music.
Exactly. It should be a global optimization, not at each stage individually.
I have a question actually that just came in from Enrico, and it's a great place to ask this question. His question is, do you see inventory optimization in your larger network, outside of your 4 walls, if you will, or outside of what's in your direct control, as you work with customers and suppliers? So think of buyer or supplier managed inventory. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. So I'll give you an example. I'm currently working with a couple of my clients are in the apparel industry, and for them actually, the most risk and the highest source of inventory for them are raw materials, fabrics at mills. It's not necessarily about making sure that I have enough inventory within my 4 walls, although it is. But it's also making sure I model that network cradle to grave, maybe from my retail stores all the way back through my cut and sew facilities, all the way back to the fabric mills, so that I truly understand, the total network, and I can optimize that globally.
Right. I'll give you 2 quick examples. First one is like you said, a supplier managed inventory. So some of our customers are forced by contract to keep a pile of inventory at their customer's front end. Mm-hmm. And they can go in and have a conversation and say, here's, use the math, use the data to say, here's how much we should be holding, and it saves everybody money, right? And it raises flexibility, you don't have obsolescence, all that stuff. And the other quick example would be co-manufacturing or co-packing. In these companies that have that co-manufacturing, co-packing in their supply chain, that is on the critical path of their delivery to the customer. That's not external in any sense. It just happens to not be on their balance sheet.
Yeah.
Right? So operationally, they have to manage that inventory because it has a direct path. When we look at this picture globally, it has impact on delivering to the customer.
And the challenge, and you just triggered it in my mind there, is like when companies treat optimize locally, you're not optimizing globally. Right.
Right. I agree with that. Now, on this theme of visualization and also the need to finalize a plan, publish it, monitor it, I mean, Chris, what are we seeing here? I see lots of pretty graphs.
Yeah, pretty graphs. So this is one of the unique advantages of using an integrated supply chain solution like Logility is this ability to build and leverage analytics that give you that insight into your supply chain, right? So this is a home page with a bunch of different KPIs on it that would drive actions, hopefully predictive alerts to the correct people, and then drive them into where that problem could be solved, right? So whether you're looking at service levels, inventory turns, working capital efficiency, and you can segment this by the business, by the product, and you get exactly the information you need to do your job.
I think the one key thing I'd like to call out here is, while we call it, we've talked a lot about the monitor, the finalize and publish is really important too.
Yes.
If inventory optimization is in a disparate system and the output is a bunch of values that someone has to go key in somewhere, that is suboptimal. If I've got an integrated system where once I've got consensus on my inventory values and I can immediately publish them into my downstream planning and execution systems, that is enormous in terms of value and enormous in terms of making sure that process is executed successfully.
Okay. And for me, a picture paints 1,000 words. I mean, if I can see where those pressure points are, I'm going to be so much more responsive as I track against goal. So when we think about this, the final step is driving strategic value. It is looking at all of these opportunities. So not just how my supply chain is configured and is performing today, but where are those opportunities for improvement as we kind of push that efficient frontier? Vinder, your thoughts?
So I think here, what I want everyone to think about is, inventory optimization can be thought in sort of two dimensions. There's the tactical, there's the tactical angle. I can update my safety stock targets in terms of days of supply based on the demand and supply uncertainty based on my network constraints. But then there's the strategic part. Once I've got the tactical in place, I can actually use an inventory optimization capability and a tool, in this, like something like Logility's inventory optimization, to actually look at structural changes in my supply chain. What if I was able to, what if we were able to model a postponement strategy? Instead of having inventory at a finished goods, at a finished goods location and in a finished goods state, I was able to have it in WIP at an upstream location where the cost is lower, because I haven't introduced the manufacturing costs, I haven't introduced the extra storage costs. I can also model the differences in lead times that I might be able to negotiate with my suppliers. The differences in, and as I mentioned earlier, if I don't have to buy an entire pallet every time, if I can buy in cases, having the ability to model these scenarios, I can then introduce structural improvements in my supply chain. That's really, to me, as I think about the next step is taking that tactical capability and making it strategic.
Yeah, so this might actually be another barrier, right, is people they get to that target stage and they don't keep going and keep the improvement going. Mm-hmm. So, when people hear this, they go, well, we just want to reduce inventory. And you do, when you do that tactical, that inventory optimization, you do get that first hit. You get that 10, 20, 30% inventory reduction. But then, like you're saying, you can then go ahead and model those policy changes, right? And that policy might be lead time. It might be service level. It might be inventory level. And you get this nice cost versus service level curve, but you also get a three-dimensional curve that's cost versus inventory versus service versus lead time, or versus batch size, right? So you can model all those different policies and put numbers instead of emotion behind those scenarios, and it'll allow you to keep making those big gains in inventory optimization.
Yep, and I'd say it's, and if it wasn't clear before, and probably the third time I've hit this home, this is not just about inventory. I can actually model transportation costs. I can model handling costs. So it's recurring and one-time benefits.
Well, and not only that, it takes into consideration my demand volatility as well. I mean, looking at, how good I'm doing as far as my demand plans, how accurate we are, and then some of my supplier volatility. If they're, what's their report card look like, and what do I have to take into consideration as a part of those trade-offs as well.
Yeah, because you see, I mean, I've seen this is when we've gone into supply chain teams and doing this, is that we have the supply chain guys who are all focused on inventory, and then you have the manufacturing guys who are like, you've given me a plan that's great for inventory, but you've driven my manufacturing cost up. At least with a capability like this, I can look at inventory and total cost all in one place, all in one capability, and drive performance on multiple dimensions of my business.
Yeah. So Chris, let's take a look at a case study, right? Let's take a look at a company that has done this, and the results, both the quick results and then some of the additional opportunity. So what we're looking at here is really a global cosmetics company. They needed to align the inventory with their strategic goals, but also keep in mind those tactical needs over time. And their goal was really to save cash. But they had an obsolescence problem, right? So they really wanted to reduce that obsolescence.
Yep.
So take us through this move from a finished goods, single stage inventory conversation to a true optimized inventory optimization.
Right. So the important thing to note here is that these folks were already one of the best run supply chains in the world. They had very smart people. They had developed their own tools for inventory optimization, but they still hit this wall. They still hit this plateau, right? So after several years, quarters of continuous reduction in inventory, they hit this plateau for a couple of quarters where they just couldn't do it anymore. And that's when they came to us and Logility, and we went in and deployed MEIO, multi-echelon inventory optimization, and that helped them break the plateau.
Okay, so help them break the plateau. Let's talk about what those results look like, and really as they realigned inventory with those service goals, tell me a little bit about what happened.
So this is a big CPG company, so fill rate wasn't really negotiable, so they have to have a 99.5 or better. That's just, that's their ante in the game. So it wasn't something where they were looking to improve fill rate, but it was absolutely critical that they don't violate their existing fill rate, because all the supply chain people would be out looking for a new job, right? So what they're looking to do is cut that inventory, and that's what they did. Amazingly enough, what they ended up doing was cutting their global safety stock in this business unit by 30%, and that resulted in a total inventory reduction of 7%, which is pretty good for a company and a business unit this size. It was over $100 million in savings. But specifically, if you look at that graph over on the right, it's just what Vinder was talking about before, where you can see the pre-optimized and post-optimized. What happened was they pushed inventory back from finished goods into WIP. You say, well, how does that save me money? Well, it saves you money because your finished good inventory, like Vinder was alluding to, is your most expensive and least flexible state. Whereas they were able to push that back into a less expensive and more flexible state. So it actually, you get that inventory reduction, but you also get flexibility to the market. And you'd see that in these results. And you don't get that unless you're looking at it in a multi-echelon way.
And it's amazing to me, Chris, as I see results like this, that companies still see those barriers as being that high. You're talking about 30% reduction. You know, it's amazing that we just think the barriers are just too high and we can't do it.
Right, but that, again, we talked about continuing to make improvements. So they continue to make improvements with the strategic modeling to the tune of 2 to 3% a year, by making some of those those structural changes, and still maintaining those high service levels. And, this is typical. You'll see a big hit in inventory reduction right up front, and Then if you use the strategic tools like the ones provided by Logility, you get that ability to keep that momentum going year over year and continue to add value to that supply chain.
Yeah, it's amazing the power in being able to plan multiple scenarios and have a high confidence level that the model that you're doing the scenario comparisons with is a solid representation of your capabilities. Because you can look at these business trade-offs, right? And they may answer certain strategic goals in one scenario and a different set in another.
Yeah, and just the fact that you can do it in minutes versus weeks, you know, if you can't solve the problem in time to use the answer, it's no good, right?
True enough. So, Vinder, our questions are queuing up, but take us through a wrap-up of this three-step approach that we just discussed, and then we can dive into some of the questions from our participants today.
Sure. So, again, it's really assessing my capability. Now, what does the business case look like? Building and sustaining that capability, process, technology, and organization, and then really taking that tactical capability and extending it to drive strategic and fundamental changes, you know, in your supply chain. And
doing that over and over and over again. I liked your description of some of the business scenarios. You know, I was speaking with a company just the other day that said the head of procurement came to them and said, hey, what if we change from our Latin American supplier to an Asian-based supplier that's offering us what we believe is a better cost? What is that going to do to our business? How do we respond? Is it really less expensive? So that's something that you could quickly assess in this kind of an environment, right?
Absolutely. You can grab that in the model and run the optimization to have your answer in minutes. And a lot of times the answers are counterintuitive because it is multi-echelon. It's like squeezing a toothpaste tube, right? You do something over here, it impacts over here.
Okay. Well, with that toothpaste in mind, I've had several questions that have come in about this. And one of the first questions was about something that we were just discussing regarding this movement or redistribution of inventory from finished goods to other stages in the inventory. Is it an automatic answer that I'm going to push it, you know, back into work in process, into raw materials, or does it just help me identify opportunities to do that? Because, you know, at every stage a company has buffer, right? All that just in case inventory that's being held in work in process, in raw material.
Yeah, well, the model itself is going to automatically figure out the best place to put the inventory given the costs and the policies. But when you say policies, what are we really talking about? It's not just fill rate, it's fill rate and service time. So if I've got a customer that needs to have a 99% fill rate in 2 days, that's a lot different than a customer that needs a 99% fill rate in 2 weeks. And that's going to really determine where you're going to position that inventory to service that customer.
Yep, and I think you know, the other component here is we have to consider the total cost. So if we put total cost constraints on this, that may mean that the inventory have to stay further downstream than upstream. It's not an automatic push it all the way upstream, especially as it impacts service and as it impacts cost. Because the transportation cost of moving inventory often just as high as the inventory itself.
Yeah, and if you've got a simple product with very high service level and off-the-shelf requirements, yeah, you're going to push a lot of that to where the customer is.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I've seen several questions come in. I just want to take a minute to address. A replay of today's webcast will be available. Also, we have a white paper on this topic, Removing the Barriers of Inventory Optimization. You are welcome to download that and share it with your peers in the company as well, other folks that you want to start thinking and strategizing about this. So I've got a question here that says, you know, what is a good source to find inventory performance benchmarks? Yeah, this is a question we get all the time, right? But I know Deloitte does work around benchmarks as well, and you try to be very specific.
Correct. So I'll do the Deloitte answer at least.
Okay.
We have what's called a global benchmarking survey. So we actually do surveys in multiple industries, so consumer packaged goods, life sciences, retail. It goes across all the industries where we do take benchmarks to say, what does good look like?
Mm-hmm.
Now, from a low, a high, medium, low, we do have those benchmarks where we can say, for this industry, X days of supply is actually pretty good performance. So that's one option. It's, we do have that information. You could say it's pretty hard to find that information publicly.
Mm-hmm.
So it often does. Often the best place is to go. Is to do your research, or I found even others just call other companies, call your peers to ask how they're doing. It's a start, but then if you want to get real serious, there's many firms out there that do the benchmarks.
Yeah, and of course we've been doing this with customers for a while.
Right.
So we have some internal information we can share, and we'll typically help people build business cases based on that, right? So at least we'll get the ballpark, a baseline that we can then test.
Yeah. I've got a question from Raj, and Raj asks, what is the best approach to starting inventory optimization? Is it to look at finished goods or to start at raw material?
I think it was step one, because that's your capability.
Okay.
It's not just about finished goods. I mean, if you're truly considering inventory optimization, you have to consider it holistically, all stages of inventory at all points in the network. You could do finished goods inventory, single stage, but it's not going to be true optimization.
Yeah, as part of that assessment, like Vinder says, you're going to find where the low-hanging fruit is for your business. It may be in a geography, it may be in a business unit. I personally like to get something that's a full supply chain, that it may not be the entire supply chain, but something that goes through all the stages, because that gives you a better understanding how your business is going to react in a inventory optimization.
And you want it to have tangible enough results that help you determine, as you roll it out to a larger problem set, what that payoff is going to look like.
Yeah, I agree with Chris. I mean, if you're going to go after this small, go after it small but holistically and quickly.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, good point. Okay, I've got a question from David, and he asks, does multi-echelon inventory optimization work differently for a process manufacturing business, or is it pretty similar to a discrete manufacturing business?
Yeah, I think it's different in our experience in process. Process has some unique requirements, especially when you get back in the supply side. There's a lot of things like tanks and cycle stock, and the technology that we're using understands all that, because there's opportunities in that cycle stock and in those tanks and in those freight cars and ships that you can tease a lot of inventory out of.
Okay. So,
but overall, it's the same problem.
Yeah, it's the same math problem. I would say there's definitely
different constraints.
There's nuance. Yeah. The nuance is how I'm storing or how I'm moving, but it's still the same: how much, where, when, how long does it take to move, and how long does it take to make it. It's a similar problem set.
So we struck a few chords with the earlier question about the ability to look into our supply network, right? You gave a great example of the apparel industry, Vinder, in doing this and looking at key raw materials. So the question came back from Emrique. Doesn't that mean that you have to have a really robust supplier relationship? I mean, this isn't something you're going to do with every supplier, but with those key suppliers, certainly you're going to want to invest in looking at those capabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're going to definitely want to look at the low-hanging fruit, and often those are going to be your biggest suppliers. And I'll be honest, I'd be shocked if you didn't have a decent relationship with your biggest suppliers, that you could be able to to work on an initiative like this with them. I'd be shocked if they held so tightly onto their manufacturing secrets or inventory secrets that they wouldn't want to improve with you. So, yes, you'll have to have some sort of relationship with them, but it's collaborative, and I found over the last 20 years, collaboration has become an increasingly important component of managing a supply chain, and it's no longer within my own four walls, and you've got your four walls. and we're locally optimizing. I think it has to be considered globally.
Yeah, and technically you can aggregate some of that stuff when you're modeling it, right? You can pick and choose what you want to model that's on the critical path or is a critical material to model to drive the inventory optimization. You don't need to get their entire pile of data and all their stuff. The other thing with the suppliers and the relationship that's so important, but there's a win in it for them, right? We're talking holistic here, so that means they're going to win, we're going to win if we start looking at the data again and stop with the emotions, right? And that'll just help that relationship.
And and to come back, especially as this is a component of S&OP. It is a component of a broader supply chain capability that has to be considered. Don't think of this as just a spot solution.
I think that's great. I also have got a couple of questions I'm gonna kind of combine here that are asking if inventory optimization, can we include expansion in our business? So moving into new markets, adding distribution centers, or consolidating distribution centers perhaps in this whole assessment of scenarios. So I may have a desire to have a higher service level in a brand new marketplace that I'm trying to penetrate versus one where I'm the chief supplier in the industry today and I've got those established relationships. Can I, in a model, be able to look at these very different segments of my business that may be pulling from the same resources?
I would say absolutely, and you should be doing that. This isn't a question of if I could do it. You should be. If you're thinking about expanding into a new region, into a new market, you should be modeling that to see what the impacts are in terms of inventory and total cost. And that feels like a no-brainer to me.
Yeah, this is a classic problem that or challenge that we go after, which is, it's typically stated in we do manufacturing, let's say in the U.S., we're going into Brazil. Should we put the stuff in Brazil? Should we ship it from the U.S.? Should it be in Miami? Where's the best bang for the buck to meet our business goals, which are service level, inventory, and cost, right? So what are the policies and where do we put that stuff?
And assuming,
and the flip side as well, we want to shut down our French manufacturing. Should we service that out of Czechoslovakia or out of whatever?
Yeah, and assuming you have the cost information on what the difference is in those different regions or different product segments look like, you should be running those scenarios and doing this analysis, and this is the perfect place to do it.
Yep.
So I've got a question here from Chris that says, not you, Chris, this is another Chris, is how frequently should we be running an inventory optimization process? Is this something we do once a year? Is this something we do quarterly? Is this something we're doing monthly or weekly?
I think that's a great question, and it's something, I hate to give the consulting answer, but when you're defining your inventory policy, the refresh frequency is a key component. So I'd say, the last few times I recently remember that we've done this, it's usually been that we've done this, we refresh the inventory policy when we refresh the forecast. So if I'm going to generate a new statistical forecast every month, I'm going to refresh my inventory policy at that point because that's when I'm going to get my new forecast variability or my demand uncertainty. That's usually the tact we take it with it. Chris?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's the same planning rhythm or supply chain rhythm that you're doing with your supply and your demand, right? So, and your S&OP. It's the same rhythm. So like you said, a monthly forecast, you're going to generate targets monthly. And then off to the side, you also have the strategic stuff, the ad hoc, right? Or as needed when something comes up.
Yep, absolutely.
So as we look at that, there's a general question here that May is asking, and it's what are the main advantages of having more work in process versus finished goods? Why is that so good?
Well, it is potentially, again, depending on your supply chain, if that's your type of business and you have some ability to postpone that inventory, it's potentially at a much lower cost, so you've added less value to it, so it's more flexible, less costly, and that's a better place overall to hold inventory in the supply chain. And a lot of times companies will just, as a knee-jerk reaction, say we don't hold inventory in manufacturing, we don't have room, we're lean, but you might get some big advantages in flexibility and cost by bolting on some storage there.
Yeah, I'll give you a great example. We worked with an auto manufacturer several years ago, and we had the exact same challenge. And where was the best place to hold the inventory? They had several models, all of which had different trim levels, different paint, different engines, different finishes. And they said, well, we need to make sure we have enough cars, but how do we know where to put them or where to put those components? And what we found for them was having moving more to a build and deploy to order model. We were able to save overall the total cost of the supply chain by having those upstream, because it was automotive, and they were extremely responsive in terms of how quickly they could do changeovers and manufacture different products. Because they were flexible in their manufacturing, having the inventory and WIP made a lot of sense. If you're not flexible, it may not make a lot of sense.
But it is something you could run the scenarios and say, here's the opportunity, maybe invest in it, that sort of thing. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Well, we've got literally tons more questions, but I am going to need to move us along and to announce our winner for the $50 Under Armour gift card, and also to remind our audience, if they'd like to download a copy of the white paper about removing the barriers to inventory optimization, you've got that opportunity to do so as well. Just go to the Logility website, and you'll be able to download it from there. I want you to think about or share with us that one piece of advice that you want our audience to take away with them today. What one word of wisdom or one piece of advice could you offer? Vinder, let me start with you.
I would say the one thing, if I left you with, the one thing that I would leave you with is this isn't that hard. If you follow the steps, this isn't that hard. The barriers are perceived. They're not always facts. This isn't that hard.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. How about from you?
So yeah, there's barriers, but they can be overcome, and we've got the methodology, we've got the technology. So what you need is the leadership, and we can get to those rewards and that value.
Terrific. So if you want to learn more about inventory optimization, please visit www.logility.com, that's logility.com, to tap into the many great resources that are available there, or tap into the resources that are available in APEX. They've got some great materials in this area as well. These webcasts are a part of Logility's ongoing commitment to educating supply chain practitioners on a variety of important topics. And on behalf of APEX and Logility, I would like to thank Vinder Sadi and Chris Russell for sharing their expertise and their insight with us today on removing these barriers to inventory optimization. Thank you both.
Thank you. It's fun.
Until next time, I'm Corinne Bursa, and I'd like to thank you for joining us.